A battle between good and evil. Is this merely a reboot of the Bush era of diplomacy, do you think?
I think there actually is more to it, in the sense that we see an administration, a president who's not a politician. So one of the struggles of the Trump administration has been shifting from the reality, to the rhetoric of the campaign to the reality of power. On the domestic front, an argument can be made that it is still struggling. But on the foreign policy front, we've seen a gradual evolution taking place. This speech today marks an important part of that gradual evolution to the reality of power in American foreign policy around the world. Many in the media said this would be a reset with the Muslim world. I mean, I disagree with that. There is not a monolithic Muslim world. This was largely, it was a reaffirmation of America's strong relations with traditional allies, and particularly in the Middle East. And much of the rhetoric that he said and much of the examples he was using was not just Saudi Arabia, but countries of the region. He mentioned Egypt, he mentioned Bahrain, he mentioned several other countries, once again, that are American allies. Specifically, we're talking about the countries of the Gulf, of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. So you see a president who's slowly coming into foreign policy. Although it's constantly being overshadowed by problems at home, I think gradually he's coming into the presidency, international, on the foreign policy front. We see more responsible rhetoric taking place. Diplomatically, he said what needed to be said. And if you look at the rest of his trip, there is a symbolism when he mentioned the three faiths, the three Abrahamic faiths. Obviously, his trip to Saudi Arabia, the trip will be taken to Jerusalem, and also his trip to the Vatican. So the symbolism is important in terms of reaching out to the three faiths. But a lot of it has to do with geopolitical realities in American foreign policy. And it's a way, once again, it's reaffirming America's its relations with traditional allies in the Middle East. It'll be done at the G7 summit in Taormina, Sicily, with our traditional economic allies, and at the NATO summit in Brussels. So we see a theme here, a current taking place, is a lot during the campaign. Many traditional allies feared what would happen when Trump came to power. This trip is a process to try to basically say we're a strong ally, we are a traditional ally, and will remain the United States in terms of support worldwide. So that's an element. Obviously, I think there's a third part also here, is that this, if you look at it within the geopolitical context of the region, he specifically mentioned Iran in terms of Iran's activities, whether it's in Syria or it's in Yemen, throughout different parts of the region. Under President Obama, what you had was many of those traditional allies, being Saudi Arabia in particular and the GCC countries, their perception was that Obama was being too friendly with the Iranians and not basically promoting the interests of his traditional allies. And they would use the example of the Iran nuclear deal. Trump, what he's trying to say is that basically, I'm not Obama. I'm going to reaffirm those traditional. And for the leaders of the GCC countries and Saudi Arabia in particular, it's refreshing to hear that commitment from their policy perspective. And obviously, the timing of this summit is actually it's critical, because you see the result of the elections in Iran with the re-election of President Rouhani. His policy has been for his first term, now going into his second term, is more of an opening of Iran at home and abroad. So in that sense, you look at Iran, that's evolving itself. Obviously, they have the Iranian, their current activities in Syria and Yemen and other places is still a large concern for the GCC countries and Saudi Arabia. So Iran, despite the victory of Rouhani, it may be refreshing to many in the outside world, but also there's also that element that for many leaders, despite whatever change and whatever rhetoric of reform, Iranian activities still have not changed. And President Trump's visit to the region is reassuring to many of its traditional allies.
But going to Trump's narrative of Iran as the main regional destabilizer, in an editorial published this Sunday, Iran's foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, is advising Trump to discuss how to avoid another September 11 attack with his Saudi hosts. What's the message there?
Yeah, definitely. And even on the American in the American media and at home in the U.S., people would say, well, who were the bombers behind 9/11? The vast majority of them were citizens of Saudi Arabia. So, yeah, I mean, that's definitely a reality. Basically saying is that you talk about Iran destabilizing the region, but yet elements from Saudi Arabia have caused instability around the world, obviously pointing to 9/11. The part of the meeting today is, for example, the building of that center for counter-radicalism that was referred to by Trump. Basically, it's saying is that there's been a wakening up in the region amongst leaders, the leaderships of Saudi Arabia, the leaderships of the various countries of the GCC, and saying that maybe in the past we weren't as active in condemning this form of extremism. Now we've turned the corner, and we ourselves will be leading that process to counter terrorism. And the Saudis will point out that at home they've cracked down on it. They've been trying to crack down on the financing. So yes, there's that argument that the origins, if you go back 15, 20 years and even beyond, many of those supporting these radical elements were coming from Saudi Arabia and from the Arabian Peninsula. But part of the purpose of today's meeting is to reaffirm that we are engaged directly in the battle against that form of ideology that may have emanated from our region, but we're on the front lines of fighting it. And once again, it's President Trump. He used the term radical Islamic radicalism once, maybe twice. But I think throughout his entire speech, he emphasized the words combating extremism and radicalism. So he himself, his rhetoric has evolved from the campaign to the reality of power.
It's also a fine line to tread. I mean, a senior Israeli cabinet minister has voiced concern about the US's $110 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia that Trump was touting at the beginning of that speech. How hard is it for Trump to find his feet in this region?
He's graduate. It's not his feet in the region. It's the people he surrounded himself with. And specifically, one of the key individuals in all of this is General Mattis. He was head of Central Command, which involves the Middle East and parts of Africa. So I think his appointments, he's appointed a safe pair of hands. And also he has, as his national security advisor, Lieutenant General McMaster. McMaster's obvious extensive experience on the ground in Iraq and other places in the region. So he throughout the campaign, he would always talk about his trust in the generals. So I think the people surrounding him people in the region are looking at, particularly the leaders of the GCC countries in Saudi Arabia, and not just looking at the president and his rhetoric. They're looking at who he's surrounding himself with, and they're generally considered a safe pair of hands.
Now, as you mentioned, this was a very religion-oriented speech, and it's part of a very religion-oriented trip that will include stops in Israel and the Vatican. Should and can religion be a diplomatic tool?
But it has been. I think what's happened in American foreign policy, not just in the U.S., but in much of the Western world over decades, is that leaders and foreign policy establishments have underestimated the importance of religion and what it means to people, particularly in very traditional countries. We in the Western world we've evolved in recent decades into a mostly secular world. A secular, liberal world, whereby in other countries it's different. The realities are different, and much of the foreign policy from the West, and particularly from the U.S., has been operating on the premise that most of the world is secular, underappreciating, undervaluing, and underestimating what religion means to other people. In recent years, I think there's been a wake-up call, obviously, with the terrorism issue. The motivating factors of terrorism, not just religion, the cultural issues, social, political, diplomatic, at all levels. But I think that religious element has been underestimated for far too long. And the trip this first foreign trip of Trump, I think, has taken that religious element, included it into foreign policy, and actually giving it its proper role. And the symbolism of going to Saudi Arabia, to Israel, and going to the Vatican is extremely important. But not to underestimate, this is a very geopolitical trip also. There's more geopolitical than religion, but the religious element has been emphasized and deserving, I think, in my opinion, its proper place.
And you mentioned the cultural and social issues at stake also. Trump's wife, Melania, and daughter, Ivanka, were apparently the only women in that room today. And earlier today, Ivanka was quoted as saying that Saudi Arabia has made encouraging progress in empowering women, but more freedom is needed. What can we make of that?
Well, I wouldn't, what was said by the statements you just made, I'd put more emphasis on what the president stated in his speech. And what he stated in the speech, we're not here to teach you, to advocate. If change takes place in the region, it'll be gradual change and gradual evolution over time. So I think that's a key element for many of America's traditional allies in Saudi Arabia and in the GCC countries, is that for far too long, they think that American foreign policy has done too much preaching. And when he talked about principled realism, realism. I think principled realism is saying, yes, we have our principles, we have our values, but it will promote it within a reasonable context, not trying to change societies and overhauling societies according to some ideological litmus test. So I think that's important. The president's words were very, very important about that, that if you have change for women in your societies, it'll be a very gradual one. It'll take place over time, and not that one where we're going to actively or proactively push.
Marco Vicenzino, thank you very much for having spoken to us. Thank you for your analysis. So